Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the RTX 4070 Super. Now, most 4070 Super reviews are going to be comparing it to the 4070, maybe even the 3070, the 4070 Ti Super, and maybe even the 4060 Ti. And they're going to show you how much of an improvement it was from last year's model or the year before's model, which is fine and entertaining and makes for good content. However, in this video, we're going to have a more realistic approach. And what I mean by that is, we're going to be upgrading my personal PC, which I built in 2020, and it currently has a 2070 Super. We're simply going to swap the GPU with the 4070 Super, and we're not upgrading any other components. So rather than test this GPU with the latest and greatest processors and the newest components, like most reviews on YouTube do, which is fine because they're showing you the maximum potential if you go with a really high-end build. But what about those people who are just looking to upgrade their GPU and still have a decent CPU that they're not ready to upgrade? Well, that's why I'm here. We're going to see what kind of improvement we get when throwing a 4070 Super in about a 4-year-old build. After reading a lot of comments on other videos, it seems like most people don't upgrade every year. Some people are still even rocking the i7 4790K, which is about 10 years old. Now, I don't recommend you pair the 4070 Super with this CPU, but the point is, most people looking to upgrade their GPU are probably going to try to keep their CPU as long as possible. And obviously we're going to be comparing the last generation of Super models that they made back in 2019 versus the new Super models in 2024. So we're going to be doing some benchmarks, some gaming, and we're going to see how much of an improvement the 4070 Super is from the 2070 Super. It's going to be Super Sicko Mode. Before we get started, please like and subscribe. It really helps me out. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments below. And every video I post will be more sicko mode than the last. All right, let's get to it. First things first, let's talk about the specs of the two GPUs. There's about a 4.5-year difference between the releases of these two GPUs, but the 4070 Super has faster clock speeds, newer architecture apparently designed to give you superpowers, support for DLSS 3 versus 2, about triple the amount of shader and ray tracing cores, and a butt ton more of tensor cores, and not only more VRAM with 12 gigs, but it's also using faster GDDR6X RAM, and there's a big difference in CUDA core count, which isn't always a clear indicator of which GPU is better, but all these different improvements should give us a really good bump in performance. But what I really want to find out is by how much. But before we do that, let's give you a little background of these GPUs. When the 2070 Super came out, it really wasn't a crazy jump in performance from the previous 20 series GPUs. It was more of a refresh, about a 10 to 15% bump in performance over the 2070. And that's pretty much the case for the 4070 and the 4070 Super. And the 20 series Super cards were also the first time that nvidia introduced the Super series. In the past, they had just been using like Ti version, if you're wanting like a souped up version of that card. So the Super cards were a little different and kind of weird. And then for the 30 series cards, they went back to Ti. For example, there wasn't a 3080 Super, it was just a 3080 Ti whenever they did their refresh. And then for the 40 series cards, they went with Super again. I'm not sure why, but it is what it is. Now nvidia still has a 40 series Ti card, the 4070 Ti, and during this new refresh, they came out with a 4070 Ti Super, which they've never combined Super and Ti before. Maybe next year they'll come out with a 4070 Ti Super Ultra Mega, even will impress your friend's mom version. But anyways, back to the 2070 Super. When I initially bought the 2070 Super, I was expecting this to be a 1440p card, and at the time, it was. I was like, dang, this can handle anything in 1440p. Nowadays, there are some games like Starfield. Hello darkness, my old friend. The 2070 Super kind of struggles to play that in 1440p. I would even say Cyberpunk, if you're wanting to play ultra settings, kind of struggles. But those games weren't out whenever this GPU came out. By no means is the 2070 Super a slouch. It can still pretty much play any game. There's still gonna be a lot of people that say, I don't need to upgrade my 2070 Super, it's just fine. I'm upgrading because I play games like Command & Conquer 3, Minesweeper, and let's just talk about the design really quick. The 4070 Super pretty much has the same design as the 4060 Ti, except it's black. In other words, it's a BBC, big black card. Well, it's actually not that big. But NVIDIA's been doing this design pretty much since the 3000 series GPUs, except those were gray and black. This one's just all black, murdered out, which honestly looks pretty sick. I still like the look of the 2070 Super. It just looks kind of clean, minimalistic, while still being kind of flashy. Let's talk about my personal build that I have it in. As I mentioned earlier, the CPU I have is the i7-10700K, 8 cores, 16 threads, 5.1 gigahertz, part of the Comet Lake Intel processors, so still pretty solid. It's on a Gigabyte Z490 Aorus master board, which honestly looks pretty sicko mode still. Cooling the CPU, I'm using the Corsair H150i Elite Capellix AIO cooler. This was before screens were pretty common on the coolers. 1TB Samsung 970 EVO Plus, 32 gigs of DDR4 3200 MHz G-Skill RAM, obviously the 2070 Super, which will be upgrading to the 4070 Super, and an 850 watt power supply, and it's all inside of the Corsair 678C case. The build's alright, it could look better. I think even one of my fans on my radiator's gone out. I'm gonna replace that soon. But anyways, let's go over some benchmarks that we ran. So this is the Cinebench test, which is just strictly a CPU test. And the reason why I'm showing you this is to get an idea how the i7-10700K performs to the latest CPUs. So in the multi-core test, there's definitely been big improvements over the last 4 years. And when you go to the single core test, which is more important for gaming, you'll also get pretty big improvements over the last 4 years, except between the 14th and 13th gen. They're pretty much identical, which makes it feel like the 14700K is trash. But anyways, if you're needing an AMD processor to compare it to, I would compare it to the Ryzen 5 5600X, which in one of my previous videos we came to the conclusion that the 5600X is still worth it in 2024, so the 10700K is still a very capable processor. The next gaming benchmarks that I ran were the 3D Mark benchmark tests, starting with Firestrike Extreme, and now that we're getting into the gaming benchmarks, we're going to see just how much of an improvement the 4070 Super is over the 2070 Super. Right off the bat in Firestrike Extreme, there was an 85% increase in score. That's actually a crazy big improvement, more than I was actually expecting. And moving on to Time Spy, which is kind of more CPU based, you still get a 78% increase in score. And I decided to do another test that I don't normally run. It's called Port Royal, and it's 3D Mark's ray tracing benchmark. And the 4070 Super was about 114% better than the 2070 Super. That's a hell of a lot of improvement. And remember, we're only upgrading the GPU. We're not upgrading RAM, motherboards, or CPUs. Now let's move on to some gaming. The first game I ran was Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 1440p ultra settings. This game came out in 2018, which to me doesn't seem that long ago, but for you younger people, this game may seem hella old. The reason why I'm testing this game is because the 2070 Super was designed to play games like this. So that's why at 1440p, the 2070 Super actually does pretty well at ultra settings, giving you an average of 112 frames per second. And the 1% and 0.1% lows were pretty much identical to the 4070 Super. But my average FPS on the 4070 Super did go up by 35 frames. Going to 1080p, this is where the gap starts to close. 1% and 0.1% lows, pretty similar, and about a 16 frame per second increase in average FPS. Now when we turn ray tracing on at 1080p, the 1% lows and 0.1% lows of the 4070 Super stay more consistent, while the 2070 Supers drop a little bit. But still, the 2070 Super still does pretty well in this game. And the next game I ran was Starfield, 1440p ultra settings, and let's just say the 2070 Super was not designed to play this game at 1440p. It only got about half the average FPS that the 4070 Super got, and 1% lows and 0.1% lows were 25 and 17. Not very good. The 4070 Super's FPS wasn't the greatest, but at least it was playable. At 1080p ultra settings, the 2070 Super still struggled, while the 4070 Super's average FPS was still about double of the 2070 Supers. Both 1% and 0.1% lows were kinda bad, but honestly I blame the game for this. But overall a pretty big improvement if you're upgrading to the 4070 Super. After that we ran Cyberpunk, 1440p ultra settings. I was happy to see that the 2070 Super was averaging over 60 FPS. 1% and 0.1% lows weren't far behind, but the 4070 Super completely obliterates the 2070 Super's FPS. 138, 110, 91. Those are pretty healthy numbers. Going to 1080p, the 2070 Super does improve to 96 frames per second average. It doesn't compare to the 4070 Super's 212 frames per second average, so a crazy jump in improvement. And honestly, these are probably the highest settings you want to play with on the 2070 Super. Now moving on to 1080p ray tracing, the 2070 Super struggles to even hit 60 FPS, while the 4070 Super almost triples the average FPS of the 2070 Super. Even though the 2070 Super has ray tracing, you can't really use it because your FPS suffers. So if ray tracing is important to you, it looks like the 4070 Super may be your next GPU. Then after that, we ran Red Dead Redemption 2. 1440p ultra settings, the 4070 Super averages over 100 FPS, while the 2070 Super kinda struggles to get over 60 FPS. Now it's still playable with the 2070 Super, but since your 1% and 0.1% lows are below 60, you may need to go down to 1080p. And at 1080p, it seems like that's the 2070 Super sweet spot. Obviously the 4070 Super is going to improve as well, but at least in this game, if you're wanting to play 1440p, it looks like you're gonna have to go with the 4070 Super. I mean, I guess you could turn down some of the settings at 1440p to play with the 2070 Super, but I like to play at Ultra. It's either Ultra or nothing. And the final game we ran was GTA 5. So 1440p ultra settings, this game is like 10 years old, so you would expect both GPUs to handle it no problem, which they did. 97, 73, 64 is nothing to complain about on the 2070 Super, but 141, 106, 74 is much better on the 4070 Super. Now going to 1080p, the gap closes. Neither of the cards have any issue playing this game when paired with an i7 10700K, so I would say if you have a 2070 Super and this is one of the main games you play, you shouldn't be complaining. So after figuring out all this data, what does it actually mean? Well, it means
your mom's a hoe.
Whether your mom's a hoe or not, it means that at 1440p, the 4070 Super can play any game at ultra settings. Any game I threw at it, including Starfield, the 4070 Super did not struggle, even when paired with a 4-year-old i7 10700K. And remember, the point of this video was to show you how much of an improvement the 4070 is over the 2070 Super. Rather than showing you the improvement that the 4070 Super has over the 4070, I decided to go with a real-world scenario, where the average gamer isn't upgrading their GPU every year, or even building an entire system every 4 to 5 years. What kind of improvement should you expect from the 4070 Super if you're just looking to upgrade your GPU and not any other components? The 4070 Super is quickly becoming my favorite card, because even though it's not a very cheap card, I get amazing 1440p performance with any game I play. And if I want to take advantage of ray tracing, I actually can with this card. The 2070 Super struggled when I played Cyberpunk at 1080p with ray tracing on. And according to 3D Mark, in the Port Royal ray tracing test, I more than doubled my performance with the 4070 Super over the 2070 Super. So I would say this is a realistic upgrade. Maybe sell your 2070 Super for 200-300 bucks and apply that towards the 4070 Super. But like I said earlier, it depends what games you play. For some people, a 2070 Super is all that they need. If you're trying to play the latest AAA titles at 1440p, especially with ray tracing on, the 4070 Super is the way to go. And also, if you like black, this is the perfect BBC for you. Let me know what you guys think. Would a 4070 Super be a realistic upgrade for you guys in your system? You know, this is my more realistic approach to what kind of improvement you should expect from the 4070 Super. Hopefully this helps. Please like and subscribe. It really helps me out. Me and my boys Klaus and Josh Allen work pretty hard to make sure that every video is as sicko mode as possible. And like always, have a sicko mode day.